Okay, well then, let's liven things up and get musical and move on to the Psalms, which will in fact be the next section of the writings that we'll be talking about. And the writings really are sort of an everything else category, right? Why are they called something as bland as the writings? Right? Aren't all the other things we've been talking about so far the writings too, right? Or at least writings. The writings is going to incorporate a large array of different kinds of literature. There's going to be some erotic poetry in there. I hope you won't be too disappointed. We're not going to spend lots of time talking about it, just because I assume that college students get enough erotic poetry from other sources. But we're going to have things that resemble history. We're going to have retellings of stories that actually overlap with the journalistic history, poetry and wisdom, and other things. And today I just want us to introduce the Psalms and in the process introduce the characteristics of Hebrew poetry. And as I said, this is the most natural point of doing this because the Psalms provide Hebrew poetry par excellence. But we've already encountered some poetic passages, and in some cases quite extensive ones in the prophetic writings and elsewhere. And so I want us to talk at least a little bit about this today so that next time, right, because there's a range of Psalms that I'm asking you to read. Some of them are quite short, right, and so the sheer number of numbers on the readings shouldn't terrify anyone, right. Not only are they brief, but they are also indented as you expect, and so even when it's got several lines, they're not whole lines, and so it shouldn't be that arduous. So what are the characteristics of poetry? Right? If I ask you, what does poetry have? Right? Oftentimes it has meter, right, which means sort of number of syllables that with accents in certain places. Rhythm. Right? What do we mean by rhythm? I got rhythm. Yeah. What's rhythm? Yeah.
It's like kind of a flow, like forward potential.
Yeah. Pardon?
Hickory dickory dock.
Hickory dickory dock. Okay. Everyone get that illusion, or does that help or not? Yeah. Where are the music majors? Come on, we've got some here. I know. Yeah. Anyone want to define rhythm for these people, or? It's got a beat to it. Will that do for our purposes? It's yeah. In fact, there's a lot of overlap with meter. I mean, one of the reasons why oftentimes having, particularly in song, meter becomes important is because if you have too many syllables, then you can't fit them into the melody, right? And for those of you who have ever tried to sing one set of words to another tune, and you're trying to fit in the words, you rhyming, right, as typical of poetry. Less so perhaps in modern poetry, but historically. Right? Roses are red, violets are blue, some poems rhyme, but this one doesn't. And the reason why some of you are chuckling is because, right, the whole thing with roses are red, violets are blue is, that, it ends with ooh, right, similar sound. And so not doing that, right, is interesting, and sometimes amusing. Are these things characteristics of Hebrew poetry, right? The things that we think of as characteristic of poetry are. And to the extent that we're thinking of the Psalms, were they sung in the modern sense at all? And it's a very interesting question, right? One of the things that we get at the start of various Psalms, and some of you may have encountered Bibles where there are like little headings of sections to give you an idea of what's in them and help you find things more quickly. And those are all added later, right? But in the case of the Psalms, right, the numbering of the Psalms and these little subheadings that you get, right? A Psalm of Thanksgiving of David, or literally to David, right? A Psalm. Right? Those are actually there in the Hebrew text itself. And in some cases, right, we have terms used or phrases used that might indicate something. Right? Were these sung? Were they chanted? Used in some other way? Were they recited? How were these used? What did it sound like? We don't have any music to go with them. Right? right? Although there have been attempts to extrapolate from accent markings things about the music. Right? Psalm 22, it says, to the leader, right? According to the deer of the dawn, right? What the heck does it mean, according to the deer of the dawn? Right? Or Psalm 69, to the leader, according to lilies, right? One very real possibility is that there were songs, right? Deer of the dawn, lilies, right? These were in the top 40 right? Countdown in ancient Israel. In fact, somebody told me recently that, in fact, on a friend of my son's, I overheard them talking, and he mentioned that on Radio Disney there's a top 30 countdown, and I was really struck by that. That means that between, compared to my time when I was young, nowadays there are 10 less good songs every week because we used to have the top 40 countdown. So I had a suspicion, but it seems to have been confirmed. Anyway, be that as it may, right? It seems like in some instances we actually have reference to songs that are not part of the psalm, right? Songs that were simply well-known tunes or perhaps well-known ways of playing things that are appealed to here. In some cases, we have references to what presumably were either types of songs or types of instruments, and we don't know what they were, right? We have Psalm 16, a miktam of David. Why is it called a miktam of David? Because nobody knows what a miktam is. Otherwise, they would have translated it. Right? Psalm 52 has a maskil of David. Psalm 53, according to Mahalat, a maskil of David. Right? What are these things? Musical terms that we don't know how to translate. Right? And one of the most famous things in the Psalms is that every so often you'll have the word Salah, right? Which may have been a pause, may have been an indication to the choir to do something at that point. There's a lot in relation to the musical terminology that we simply don't know what to make of it. Largely because in Hebrew, a lot of words end the same way, right? When you're talking about, where we'd say to you or belonging to you or of you or things like that, Hebrew puts appendixes on, or suffixes on the ends of the words. A lot of nouns and a lot of words end the same way. And so having things that sound the same, end with the same sound is really uninteresting. And I think that's one of the reasons why in Hebrew, ending with the same sound is not something that's characteristic of Hebrew poetry. It just wasn't interesting. What does characterize Hebrew poetry are what we might call thought rhymes. So instead of having a rhyming of the sound, you have a rhyming of ideas between two verses, right? And it's this two-verse or two-line unit that is characteristic of the Psalms. That's why you have Hebrew poetry indented the way that you do, right? So you have a line, and then the next line is indented, then a line, then the next line indented, indicating to the reader, right, for your convenience, that you have these two-line units. The three main types of parallelism, right, or thought rhymes, are as follows. I'll give you some examples from things that you're actually going to read for next time, and at least some of these. And so, give you some things to watch out for as you're reading, right? Psalm 22, verse 5. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not disappointed, right? And so you can see sort of A, B, right? In fact, to you they cried, result, saved. In you, trusted, and result, not disappointed, right? So the you, the they, the action, right, with God as the object, and the result, right, running in parallel between the two lines. A second type is antithetical parallelism, right? For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish, right? And so you have way and way, which are similar, but you have righteous and wicked in contrast, the Lord knows versus perishing in contrast, right? And so a clear relationship between the two lines, but antithetical, right? Opposites. And then synthetic parallelism, which basically means you do a sort of A, B, B, C kind of thing, right? Where you take up the idea at the end of one line and then carry it further, right? So in you our fathers trusted, they trusted, repeating the last idea of that previous line, and you delivered them, right? So carries the idea a step further. There are some longer structures, including alphabetical acrostics. What the heck is an alphabetical acrostic? Yeah.
Like where you, like I would choose my name and I would spell it out and I would come up with adjectives and describe it?
Yeah, but you'd start with each letter of your name. Yeah, exactly right. That's what an acrostic is. And if it's an alphabetical acrostic, then what it's doing in this case is starting with each subsequent letter of the alphabet. Right? So it's as if in English you go, the first line starts with A, second line starts with B, C, D, E, F, G. Obviously, that doesn't translate exactly into the sounds of Hebrew, but there is an alphabetical order, right, in Hebrew, the Hebrew alphabet as well. And the New Jerusalem Bible, right, it's a well-known Catholic translation that some of you may have seen, actually takes some of these and where possible tries to translate them with first line starting with A, next line starting with B, just to give you as the reader a sense of what this might have been like to read. And so if you're interested in that sort of thing, check it out. And we talked also about larger structures, inverted parallelisms, where it goes A, B, C, D, and then C, B, A, right, reversing it on the way back. So just introducing these briefly, these are the kinds of units, right? These two-line units are typical of Hebrew poetry, usually related either synonymously, antithetically, or synthetically. Keep an eye out for those as you're reading from the Psalms for homework. There have also been attempts to define different types of psalms, and you'll see some discussion of this in the textbook, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But certainly one thing that's noticeable is that there are psalms that have some of the same kinds of structure, right? So some kind of call to worship is typical of the hymn, and then a section that basically gives a reason for the call to worship, right? Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout to the rock, to God, the rock of our salvation. For He created all things. Or for, with an outstretched and mighty arm, He saved us from our enemies, or something like that. And then a conclusion. The lament, right? You're going to have some examples of this, right? Not very typical of modern day worship in a lot of traditions, right? Where you say, how many of you have never sung a song, if you attend any kind of religious gathering where songs are sung, that says, God, why are you sleeping? Why are you so far from helping us? Not typical, but you find it in the Psalms. Right? In some cases, there's a confession of sin, right? I know these things befell me because of my guilt. In some cases, it's an assertion of innocence. Cursing of enemies. How many of you have never done that formally in a religious gathering? You may be in for a surprise with some of the kinds of things you find in the Psalms. In some cases, the lament, which is basically a cry for help or a complaint, ends with an expression of confidence. Some of them even have a mini hymn at the end, right? So it'll shift from a sort of negative, complaining kind of tone to a positive, praise kind of tone at the end. There are other types as well, and these are not things that are, sort of set apart. It's not as though the Psalms themselves give us these clear indications. This is a hymn, this is a lament. It's an attempt to identify that many Psalms seem to have a similar kind of structure to them, right? Or similar kind of content. And one can look at content as opposed to form and also see similarities. There are sometimes things that people will call wisdom psalms because they seem to be interested in teaching something, right? Used for educational purposes, something like that. Royal psalms, right? They're psalms that talk about the king, right? Some of the psalms seem to have been perhaps used in ceremonies that the king was involved in. And that leads naturally to liturgical psalms. There are famous ones, one that mentions linking hands and branches. Another one, lift up your gates, O you ancient doors, that the King of Glory may come in. Who is this King of Glory? The Lord strong and mighty. It sounds like, even though it's not, there's no way to tell from simply the text itself, that this was probably used as part of a ceremony, right? There are those outside, perhaps the city, right, calling to those inside to open the door for a procession that has the Ark of the Covenant, for instance, and then those inside respond, and so on and so forth. There are ones that have repeated lines that suggest that perhaps the whole congregation joined in. I'm just mentioning these briefly now to give you some indication of some of the things that you might look for in the Psalms, right? So what kind of psalm is it? What is its theme? And really, this is what I want you to think about as sort of for homework, because this will be the basis to get us started talking next time. We'll look at the details of some of the Psalms, some of them very familiar, some probably unfamiliar. Which of these could you imagine yourself singing or praying? Because indeed many of these, right, their focus is on God and they are prayers, and so feel free to think of them in those terms. But which of them would you feel comfortable singing today? Are there any that you wouldn't think today simply because there are things that like cursings of enemies that you try to avoid, or there are details of ancient religious practice that just are not part of your own thought world or experience, and so can't relate to them. Just as a way of trying to stimulate some conversation, think about which of these, if any, would you feel comfortable singing, which, if any, would you not feel comfortable singing, and why. Questions, comments? Okay, well then I'm going to let you go a little early, but not before we do one last thing, and mention that there have been, and you may want to explore some of these. I can't remember if we have a presentation next time, but if we do, one obvious thing we might want to do is have some music in that, although you're under no obligation. But there have been a lot of settings to music of Psalms, perhaps more than any other part of the Bible, and I thought I'd leave you with one. There we go. You will be having a processional kind of effect, right, as you exit to this. This is a U2 song, a really old U2 song. It's called 40. Anyone want to venture a guess why it's called 40? I think I heard the answer. Pardon? What did you say? I thought I heard somebody actually say it. Psalm 40. There you go. Right. I'm guessing that the ancient Israelites did not use this particular tune, but there you go. So you're free to go. You're free to stay and listen. See you next time.